Well, g'day and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm your host, Ross Coulthart. And today I'm taking you to an area that I've long been fascinated by. All of you who've been watching me would know I've been long interested in the stories that astronaut Edgar Mitchell of Apollo 14 fame told about seeing alleged anomalous objects outside the command module on his way to and from the moon, and anomalous objects while he was on the moon. And I've been making something of a pastime of approaching astronauts cold, asking them privately whether they've had anomalous experiences. And that's a show I'd like to bring to you on a future occasion. But today, I'm very excited to bring in filmmaker Kevin Curran. Kevin's a California-based filmmaker who's worked with NASA, Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin, Burt Rutan's SpaceShipOne, and Elon Musk's SpaceX. His story of working for many years with several of the private commercial space companies alone is fascinating. And he's made a fabulous film, Beyond Blue Sky, the story of SpaceShipOne, the world's first private astronauts. And yes, it does have a UAP twist. So SpaceShipOne was a joint venture between aerospace engineer Burt Rutan's Scaled Composites company and Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. Mojave Aerospace Ventures was the overall company. For me, the film reminds me of The Right Stuff. It evokes the sense of awe and respect for the courage of the guys who were willing to take such risks. And boy, when you see the film, it's quite breathtaking, the risks these guys took. Kevin's film work literally puts you in the seat, watching on as these brave pilots put their lives on the line, flying by the seat of their pants, using their extraordinary skills to hold the craft to reach the Kármán line, the most widely recognized conventional boundary between Earth's atmosphere and outer space, an altitude of 100 kilometers, 62 miles, or to be precise, 328,000 feet above sea level. Much of the film is told through the story of a former US Navy pilot turned space astronaut Brian Binnie. In December 2003, on the first rocket-powered test flight of SpaceShipOne, Brian lands hard and veers off the runway. While the damage is minimal, the film follows him over the following months as he privately frets that this might rule him out of any opportunity to ever become an astronaut. And 6 days on from that hard landing, Brian has a paranormal event at his home that he believes gave him the nudge to keep on believing in himself, which led to him winning for SpaceShipOne the X Prize, a $10 million prize. He also broke, by the way, the previous winged aircraft record that had been set by the X-15 in 1963. Kevin, come and join us and welcome to Reality Check, sir. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Ross. That was quite an intro.
No, I'm really thrilled by your film. I loved The Right Stuff, which was a film that came out, gosh, it must be 40 years ago now, that told the story of the Apollo moon missions. And there are moments in your movie where I was quite literally holding my breath, watching Mike, one of the astronauts, dealing with, I think, 29 spins as he's going vertical towards orbit, trying to hold the craft together so that he can achieve the Kármán line. It's a breathtaking film. Were you there the whole time? How did you end up following this story?
Well, I was doing something else at the time. I ran a high-definition production company when the whole SpaceShipOne event was occurring. But I got into aerospace pretty much after 2020. It really stopped the world. There was so much pain in the world. And it made me stop and recenter and focus and say, what do I want to do with the one life that I'm guaranteed? And for better or worse, I'd read aerospace since I was a kid. So I started pursuing those types of events. I worked for Blue Origin, SpaceX. I did work with Astrobotic, with NASA and Artemis. all kinds of stuff that I felt honored to do. In the meantime, I was privately pitching a series, and I kind of hip-pocketed one of the episodes that was really close to my house. And I just called up Brian one day, and I said, "Hey, Brian, here's who I am. Here's what I want to do. I know enough about your story that your life would have been very different if it wasn't for this series of events that took place after the crash of SpaceShipOne on the first rocket-powered flight, to allow you to come back into the cockpit and to win the Ansari X Prize." It's a remarkably strange series of events. Call it fate, call it coincidence, chaos theory, whatever you want to call it. It happened. And I go, is there any truth to this kind of thread of a story? It's this remarkable like perseverance and redemption story. And he said, not only is there truth to it, I've been writing a book on this subject privately for the last 17 years. And I said, can I read it? And he said, yeah. And so he gave me a then PDF of the book. It was called The Magic and Menace of SpaceShipOne. And it was a dream for a documentarian because it was essentially a journal, a private journal of his day by day account within this pretty secretive space program.
So I'm kind of saving what he actually saw in his home yard that night, 6 days after the abortive landing of SpaceShipOne, for a little bit later in our talk. But I'm very interested for you to sort of set up Brian Binnie for me. Tell me about Brian, and also, if you could, please explain what the X Prize is, the Ansari X Prize.
Sure. The Ansari X Prize was set up by Peter Diamandis, who was I would say an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur, and he wanted to become he wanted to go to space. He had applied to NASA. He wasn't accepted, and he thought he'd never get a chance to go to space. So he is a voracious reader, and he was reading the Spirit of St. Louis, which I don't know if you or your viewers know that history, but basically the Spirit of St. Louis was allowed to succeed. It was Charles Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic, and it was spurred by a prize that was made by Ortega. It was a $25,000 prize to the first person who could fly across the Atlantic. And so Peter Diamandis had this idea, why don't I do the same thing for spaceflight? And so he essentially raised $10 million. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It involves some money being put up front and some insurance, but it was a $10 million prize to the first team that could go to space twice using the same aircraft in 2 weeks with the equivalent of 3 people, which is 600 pounds. And the first team to do that, anywhere in the world, would receive $10 million. And
now, did the rules stipulate that it had to be winged space flight? Because what's interesting about SpaceShipOne, and of course the follow-ups like Blue Origin, Virgin's Galactic, which I've forgotten the full name of it, they're all using winged craft. Was there a stipulation it be winged craft for the prize, or could it be any way of getting to orbit?
No, it could be any way of getting to orbit, but you got to remember at that time, that was 1996 when they announced it, there weren't reusable rockets. So anybody that was trying to use or create a reusable rocket, because you had to use the same craft, was going to lose.
So enter Brian Binnie. The thing I love about his story is a lot of the people I've spoken to privately, astronauts, pilots who've had sightings, they're very shy about acknowledging what they've experienced. And a lot of them, when you give them a nudge privately and say, okay, just between us, tell us what you see, they often describe anomalous phenomena, but they're worried about losing their right to fly. They're worried it's going to destroy their credibility. Brian seems to have been quite open about what he says was some kind of, he believes, almost a spiritual intervention by entities of some kind that appeared in his backyard after he had an abortive landing of SpaceShipOne during one of the test flights.
Yeah, so kind of back to address that and your original question about like who is Brian Binnie, they're very much related. So Brian's a 20-year naval pilot who flew 33 F-18 combat missions in the Gulf War. He's very buttoned up. He went to Pax River, had advanced degrees from Brown and Princeton. He's as buttoned up as you can imagine. When I was interviewing him, he would do something that really struck me. It was he wouldn't answer the question right away. He would sit and think. And I thought maybe he didn't understand the question or he didn't hear the question, but he was just processing. And that's who he is. He's a very internal person who processes all the information he possibly can given a situation. He's obviously a genius. And then he very measuredly reaches out with however he wants to respond or whatever he wants to do. He's very thoughtful.
I loved the story of how he became an astronaut.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the journey of the entire documentary, right? So, I mean, he dreamt of this since he was a kid. He was inspired by his mother. So it was his mother when he was a kid. He was growing up in Scotland, and he, was just a young kid, and he was kind of wild. He was really into sports and all kinds of things. And his mother would sit him down and talk to him about astronomy and the stars and cosmos and just what everything meant, and just kind of expanded his sense of, he called it that third dimension, the dimension of flight. But it was really his father that gave him the early love of flight. His father used to take him out and shoot these things called plain Janes, which were little wooden aircraft just on a rubber band, and he'd shoot them up into the air, and they'd go up kind of like a rocket, and then the wings would pop out, and then it would glide back down. And that was the time he was around like 3 or 4 years old. His dad was a physics professor at Purdue and just really kind of knew the power of not only parenting, but of just experiential learning, and his mom as well. And they gave that gift to him from the time he was very early.
Now, the other character in this movie who I find fascinating, and I understand he's still alive, he must be in his 80s now, is Burt Rutan, an aerospace engineer who was essentially the founder of SpaceShipOne and the guy who did a lot of the concept art to design it. Tell me about Burt Rutan.
Yeah, Burt's fascinating. I've been around a lot of these aerospace companies and around a lot of the people who run them. They're all geniuses. They're all brilliant human beings. But there's always like one that can curate that. That's the the person leading essentially that entire crew, and that was Burt. He was just incredibly gregarious. He led by inspiration and just good nature. He could be tough for sure, and very direct, but I think he was just very kind and brought all these geniuses under one banner to essentially accomplish this inconceivable goal.
Now, you say it's inconceivable, and of course, today it all seems so easy with Elon Musk's SpaceX showing reusable rockets. But of course, we're talking back in the early 2000s, there weren't reusable rockets. The only way of doing what the Ansari X Prize demanded was to have some kind of normal conventional aircraft lifting a jet-powered or a rocket-powered, rather, aircraft up to a certain altitude, releasing it, and then going like blazes with the rocket to get to the Kármán line to orbit. And that was very much the idea behind SpaceShipOne. It was a very weird-looking craft, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it was just... you get around these people and Burt's just brilliant. I mean, there's questions that I ask him that are just like, unless you're an aerospace engineer, you're not going to understand the response. But it was very unusual. It had these, anybody can go and look it up, but just porthole-like windows, and the mothership was very strange as well. It was this, almost like a bird-like albatross of a craft. But I mean, Burt was a genius. I mean, he built, he designed, that was the 316th and 318th designs that Burt had made. And I think up until that point, it was like 30 or 40 that went into production. So, I mean, he was incredibly prolific.
So how big a moment was it when Burt decided that he was going to attempt the first non-government manned spacecraft. I mean, back in the early 2000s, that was a big decision. It was almost an impossible decision, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, there was 26 teams that entered the competition to win the NCR X Prize, and Scaled Composites, or Mojave Aerospace Venture, the joint venture that Paul Allen and Scaled formed, was one of them. And they were definitely a front runner because Burt had the capability of seeing unbelievable visions to reality. He was the front runner. He had made, again, 30 to 40 designs, including Voyager, which was the first aircraft to fly nonstop without refueling around the world. So he was the front runner, but a lot of people still thought that it wasn't going to happen. There was just too many. There was just a ticking deadline for the X Prize to end by 2004, and then also just a lot of things that could go wrong. And as you see in the documentary, they almost did.
It's breathtaking at times. I mean, it reminds me a lot of the Tom Wolfe book and the eventual film called The Right Stuff, where you see the behind-the-scenes story of what it was like to be an Apollo astronaut, and you realize the risks those young men took when they literally sat on top of a rocket, on top of effectively a bomb, and took off. In this case, I think the skill that was called upon by these test pilots, by Brian and Mike, is it Mike Melville? I've forgotten his full name, but the extraordinary skill that they showed in literally, I didn't realize before how hard it is to essentially control a craft being pushed by a rocket and to avoid going into a spin. There's a moment, I hope we can use this from your film, there's a moment when Mike loses control of the aircraft through no fault of his own, and he goes through, I think, 29 spins, heading vertically up towards orbit. And frankly, correct me if I'm wrong, if he hadn't been able to correct that spin, there's absolutely no way he would have survived, is there?
No, that's what the engineers told me. I mean, I was sitting with, when I was interviewing Mike at the time, there was another engineer who was the lead engineer sitting just off camera, and he said that if they didn't correct it, they would have been a fiery coffin on reentry. But they corrected it with something called a reaction control system, and it just once again kind of showed how much Burt had thought about everything that could possibly go wrong and how to correct it.
There's a great line in the show where I think it's Doug Shane. He talks about test flights. They're like doing a physics lab experiment in an aeroplane. And there's another line, you repeat doing these test flights until you have the courage. But essentially what you're driving is a rocket-propelled glider. These guys didn't have a lot of control, but they were calling on all of their expertise as stick and rudder pilots, people who'd learned how to fly intuitively aircraft over many decades. Every ounce of that skill set was being used to hold this wobbly, weird craft all the way to orbit, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got to remember, it was all of this stuff was created from scratch. A simulator, a rocket ship, a mothership, everything. It was just something they couldn't go down to Walmart and buy any parts, or anything. And so they did it for, initially it was a fixed price of $19 million. It ended up being a little bit more than that, for the whole program, 3.5 years, start to finish. But yeah, absolutely. It was stick and rudder. They didn't have the budget to do this, computer controlled guidance to space. So they just had an avionics system. They had never flown supersonically before this program. So they became the first privately funded supersonic craft also in this program. There are 2 of 3 pilots ever to fly stick and rudder to space. 2 of 3. The only other one is the X-15 pilot. So these guys were cowboys, and you can see it in the film. I mean, it's just, you're trying to control something that's going, Mach 2, Mach 3, stick and rudder, So there's all kinds of anomalies that can happen because of that, because you're reacting, and sometimes you're inducing other oscillations because you're reacting to something that's happening, and you're going through transonics, which creates strange vibrations. They hadn't done wind tunnel testing. So there's all kinds of just wild moments within the program where either things could have gone wrong, but again, these were incredibly intelligent engineers that had the wherewithal to think of almost everything to get them safely to space.
There's a hilarious but also quite disturbing moment where Mike Melville, who's quite surprisingly, he's quite old. He's in his 60s at the time, I think. And he's a fantastic flyer. He's clearly, I think, the best intuitive flyer amongst all of the test pilots that SpaceShipOne had. And he's talking about the impossibility of bailing out of SpaceShipOne. He's shown doing a rehearsal for the bailout and seeing what he's got to do to get out of the cockpit in what would no doubt be a catastrophic situation if he was having to bail. I think he realizes at that point there's absolutely no way that he's ever going to be able to successfully bail out of the aircraft.
Yeah, Mike, I miss him. I mean, both of them have since passed away. Mike just passed away about a month ago. And he was a beautiful human being. Brian, too. They're both amazing, amazing humans. But I remember him telling me that story. And he just had this incredible laugh. I mean, he was very popular among scaled employees. And I think in the film, you can see why. He's just this engaging force of personality. But yes, it was very... next to impossible to get out of this thing when it's, if it was doing high rates of spin, and forget about if it was going like supersonic. But you had to basically push the stick and rudder forward, screw off the nose cone, and then put your knees over and then fall out of the aircraft. And Mike, he has this really funny line. I'm going to mess it up, but it was like, to do that at a high rate of speed, I don't think there was one chance in hell you could do that. And he just laughs. He has that beautiful Mike Melville laugh.
Now, to set up the flight that I think became the defining moment for Brian Binnie, I need you to talk about what feathering involved with SpaceShipOne. It involves, as far as I can see, it involves a movement of the actual rocket engine. Can you explain what feathering involved?
Yeah, it's not the rocket engine. It's just the wings. So basically, to re-enter safely, because Burt Rutan is steeped in an aerospace background, right? So he worked out at Edwards. He worked on the F4, doing flight control, the flat spins, like helping with that. And so he had lost a friend in one of the X-15 accidents. So he knew that re-entry was incredibly dangerous. Columbia just happened. Right before or right during the space program. So they knew reentry was an incredible problem. So he wanted to solve that. And it's actually the design of the feather is the way that he secured the money for the financing with Paul Allen. So once he finally conceded to that, he knew he had safe reentry. And so what the feather does is it goes up like, essentially it's carried by a mothership, it drops, and then it's rocket propelled. And then up after the boost is done, it essentially cracks the wings. The wings float up like that, and so regardless of the orientation of space, then the craft goes like this to create maximum drag down, because it's a composite plane. If the feather didn't work, they would burn up on reentry. It doesn't have the shielding of like any one of the capsules that have reentered for NASA. But that was Burt Rutan's, again, novel, incredibly genius idea to do this. And a lot of people thought he was crazy to do it, but obviously history proved otherwise.
Obviously, there were people from NASA watching on at times. And I think in the film at one stage, you make the observation that NASA didn't think that this was ever going to work. They were obviously very skeptical that this was going to be a successful winning of the X Prize. So it looked like too much of a piece of string operation.
Yeah, it was right before the X Prize. Again, they had to fly to space twice within 2 weeks. And so after the first X Prize flight is the one you mentioned, where Mike Melville does 29 vertical rolls on his way to space, which is an unenviable record to this day. So that's an anomaly. No matter what program you're in, that's an anomaly. And usually with high-end aerospace companies, that goes into months or years of just retesting. But they had 2 weeks, and there was a ticking clock before the end of 2004 to get it up again. So what they did was they decided essentially to change the trajectory of the craft instead of modifying the design of the plane. Because again, this is test flight. So every single flight, there's a test flight. They look at anomalies. They reconfigure the design to figure out how to do things better. But on that particular flight, they did not. They just changed the trajectory. And they did that within hours. And that was unheard of to do something like that.
But before that, in December 2003, one of the original test flights, there was the first rocket-powered test flight. And Burt Rutan acknowledges in the film that it's the most dangerous flight of the program to that date. It's transonic flight before transonic wind tunnel testing. So they're actually flying the craft transonic before they've even been able to test it in a wind tunnel. And the pilot is Brian Binnie. And I think there's quite a powerful moment in the film when Brian requests a supersonic corridor. And I just love the idea that this is a private corporation asking for an opportunity to go supersonic because they're about to go into orbit. It's such a breathtaking moment in the film. And at least for the flight, it's a very successful flight for Brian, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It was actually Pete Siebel that asked for permission from Joshua, which is controlling Edwards Aerospace there. So they have a supersonic corridor. And so to go up into that corridor, Pete Siebold, who is flying the mothership, which is White Knight that dropped SpaceShipOne, calls over comms to have access to that supersonic corridor. And it's something he's never asked for before, so it's obviously a moment in that film. And I'm so sorry, what was the second part of that?
What I'm really getting to now is the flight goes well. The ship rolls upside down at 70,000 feet. He's in 0G. You can see he's not making it all the way to the Kármán line, but basically it's pushing the boundaries of a flying aircraft at that point. And Brian says delightedly, "I was hooked." And the feather deploys, thank God. There's a lot of rolling as they're coming back towards the Earth. The wings are snapping. Frankly, for me, watching on in the film work that you've done, it actually is quite breathtaking because you realize they're literally just sitting in a tin can, rolling back towards the Earth. And it really is just their absolute skill and, frankly, luck that keeps them alive in what was, I think, an extremely risky venture. But as he comes into the runway, Brian hits the runway hard, doesn't he? And what happened? Tell us what happened.
Yeah, so there's varying accounts. And again, it is just an absolutely breathtaking flight. I mean, but regarding the hard landing, as some people call it, he's coming in. And since SpaceShipOne has, again, it kind of looks like a wiffle ball from the inside. It's very difficult to tell your height above the runway. So they have these things called chase planes. And the chase plane's job, one of them is to inspect the aircraft before it lands, make sure everything's okay. The other one is to call out wheel heights as the person's getting close to the runway, because you can't really tell your height above the runway in this craft. And so Mike Melville, who is also one of the test pilots, was in the chase plane, and he starts calling out the wheel heights really, really quick. It's like 20, 10, 5, and then Brian hits the runway hard. You're supposed to flare. To flare the ship as you're getting close. But Brian, according to some, came in like a Navy pilot trying to land a carrier on, an aircraft on a carrier. And so he came in hard and crunched the right wheel. According to Brian, and what the engineers found afterwards was, without getting too deep into the technical analysis, but there was a fluid that froze, which allowed the stick and rudder to not be freed up. And they were supposed to circle it in test flight to make sure that it was, but they missed that on the checklist. So when it came time to do that, he couldn't get the reaction of the plane that he wanted. And it was just out of control, and it was heading straight down. So it actually had froze at altitude. And so what happened after that was... So
it wasn't his fault.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a mistake by Brian.
Yeah. It wasn't a mistake by Brian. That's what the engineers found. But there was two camps within Mojave Aerospace Ventures, essentially scaled. And some said hard landing from a Navy guy. And other people said, that this was the engineering thing that happened, and we kind of set him up to fail.
So this is where it starts getting interesting. Brian's obviously despondent because he thinks he's going to be blamed for that landing, which frankly didn't cause that much damage to SpaceShipOne. It was back up in operation fairly soon. But as he says in the film, he was worried that landing was going to be my story. And he went into a kind of a state of depression for the days following. Talk us through what happens in those following days.
Yeah, so kind of just to cue your viewers into what actually happened. So when he hit the runway, the right wheel snapped and he went skidding off the runway at 100 miles an hour into the dirt. And it just ripped up the entire hull and the wings of SpaceShipOne. It snapped the wheel. And so he's sitting in the cockpit, just instantly realizing that he's not going to be a go-to test pilot for the rest of the program. There's 2 other ones. And with 5 rocket-powered flights left, there's no way they're going to give him another chance to get back into the spacecraft. So he's despondent, again, incredibly intelligent, steeped in a military background and well-educated. And he's, again, silently processing, how can I get back into the spacecraft? And he could not figure out a way. So he was losing a lot of sleep. He said it felt like he was going crazy. Because he's just watching his dreams just go. He's probably not going to be a private test flight or be able to do private test flight anymore. For this company, he's not going to become an astronaut. Maybe nobody else gives him another opportunity. He's, I think, 47 years old at that point. He's watching his dream just disappear in front of him. So 6 days after that flight, he's still having trouble sleeping. And he says it was about 4 a.m. in the morning. And he had his eyes closed. And he said it looked like somebody had turned on the television, because there was these flickering lights coming through his eyelids. And he opened his eyes and the TV's not on. The lights were coming from the bedroom window. He lived out in Rosamond in a 2-story house. His bedroom was on the 2nd floor. So he gets up, he goes to the window. He opens up the window blind, expecting to see police cars have pulled over somebody at the corner of his house. Opens up the window blinds, and he said what he saw there was the most incredible thing he's ever seen in his life. And what it was he said it looked like daylight had manifested itself in his backyard, and it was dark everywhere else he can see. And within the daylight, there was these objects that were all emanating light, but they weren't the source of the daylight. Again, this was 4 o'clock in the morning, right? It's dark everywhere else. And he said about a half dozen of them were bounding around the perimeter of his wall. He had a 6-foot garden wall, and 6 of them were bounding around. They were beach ball sized, translucent, like a soap bubble, like a giant kid's soap bubble, but again, emanating light from the inside. And he said they almost looked like sentries. They were just kind of patrolling the perimeter of his yard. Above those were these volleyball-sized, and he calls them entities now at this point. They were volleyball-sized. They were also emanating light, but they were brighter. He said that they were more free-floating and free-moving. They were 20 to 30 feet above the ground. He's watching this entire thing, trying to figure out what it is. And 2 of the volleyball-sized ones approached the window. This is all within 40, 50 feet of him in the backyard. And 2 of the volleyball-sized objects come toward the window, through the window, into him. He turns around thinking that they're going to be behind him, and they're not. So he goes, in the film you see it too, it's just whatever they were, if they were probing me or checking me out and finding nothing of interest, he turns his attention back to the backyard. The whole thing gradually fades away. Watched it for over a minute. Again, highly trained observer, highly credible observer. And it shook him to his core. What is this? As a person of science and advanced degrees, what is this thing I just witnessed? But that was his experience.
He attributes that sighting to giving him a reason to keep on going, doesn't he? It gave him self-belief. Yeah,
he is a person of the sciences. And so he looked into every single possible prosaic explanation he possibly could. And ultimately, he decided it was something that wasn't prosaic. And he believes that whatever it was had seen him on his flight and was appearing to him. They were allowing him to see them, so that he came away with a sense of hope. He felt it was full of like hope and love, that there's something much bigger than you.
It's a breathtaking moment. And the fascinating thing is, in the film, when he finally does achieve what frankly seems to be the unachievable, he directly attributes that success to that moment in his backyard, doesn't he?
Absolutely. He said that, he wasn't sleeping for 6 days. It was torturing him. And it was that moment that made him realize that something was much bigger than him, that was allowing him to continue on, because he was thinking about like all kinds of different things, you know. He knew he had to continue with the program because it was too big. But yeah, he's going up on this final flight, and Spaceship One's captive carried by the mothership. You have an hour to get to 45,000 feet. And that whole time he was, you know, going through his rehearsed, like what he had to do in his flight plan, but his thoughts kept on returning to those bubbles of light, and that they had allowed him to keep his head on straight so that he could arrive at this day for this purpose. That's what he said. Unbelievable.
So the other story that you told me was Jeff Narcatelli's disclosures about incursions at Vandenberg. Jeff's obviously one of the whistleblowers who's come forward to Congress in recent months. And you've described to me how 3 of the incursions that Jeff's described over the base's launch pads at Vandenberg occurred 2 months prior to Brian Binnie's experience just 190 miles away on December the 23rd, 2003. Do you think it's possible that one of the supersonic flights that was flown to 70,000 feet, that flight that Brian had done, had drawn their attention?
I mean, it's possible. It's something that, I became aware of, obviously, after hearing Brian's story. Jeff, Brian told me his story in 2020, and Jeff came out last year with his testimony. I guess Ryan Graves kind of alluded to it in the first testimony as well, but that was 2023. I think absolutely. I mean, something was out there. There was 3 incursions. I'm sure your viewers know a ton about them, but real briefly, it was October 14th of 2003. There was a giant red cube that came in and was over one of the launch pads at Vandenberg. This is what Jeff testified to in front of Congress. And that was at 8:45 in the morning. I think there was 2 witnesses to that one. They watched it for 45 seconds before it, I think it drifted off over the hills to the east on that one. And then later on that night around midnight, there was another incursion. They were watching lights out over the Pacific, and the whole base was talking about them. And there was these 5 security guards on the south end of the base, and one of them over radio said, "It's coming right for us." I can't remember the exact sequence, but it's coming right for us. And then maybe they repeated it, and then it's here. And so what had happened was this light just came almost instantaneously from some speck in the Pacific that was erratic to over a silo on the south base. And that was around midnight, 5 witnesses. And the last one was...
You've spent a lot of time... Yeah, forgive me. I didn't mean to keep on going. Keep on going.
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
The last one was, he thinks sometime before October 31st, around like a week later. And it was a light that came in, and that was witnessed, I think, by 2 or 3 people. And it was a light that just came over the flight line and just hovered there and then was just gone. But all those happened within 2 months, right before Brian Binnie's experience, and not far away.
What do you think of that? What do you think of that, Kevin? Do you think it's plausible that there is something non-human that's taking an interest in human manned spaceflight?
I mean, yeah, quite. I don't know if it's manned human spaceflight that's attracting them, or I mean, obviously when you start hovering over missile silos, it gets a little into like Robert Hastings and nuclear sites and stuff like that. Who knows? I think they're probably aware of us. I mean, if we have Kepler Space Telescope and we can detect biosignatures 120 light years away, what can they detect, and from how far away? So, I mean, I think they're interested not only because we're becoming spacefaring, but because we have harnessed the power of the atom,
One of the things I've learned is talking to pilots and astronauts. They're very stiff people. You described Brian Binnie as very stiff, but he was quite unusual in the sense that he was prepared to acknowledge this anomalous experience that he had in his backyard shortly after the hard landing of SpaceShipOne. You spent a lot of time kicking the tires of similar commercial space ventures. Have you heard stories like that before, confidentially, from astronauts or pilots?
Yeah. So it came about because of Brian. So Brian, right after his experience on December 23rd of 2003, he told obviously his family, a few other people at work that were very trusted, but he kept it mostly quiet. I've since talked to those people. They verified that's when he told them about his experience. But he didn't want to give Burt Rutan any more reason to ground him, for the remaining 5 rocket-powered flights. But after he flew the last flight, before all the IP sold to Virgin Galactic and he became the second private astronaut, he was secure in his legacy. And he told a lot of people within the community at that point. And there was another test pilot who doesn't want to come forward at this point, but because they're still employed in aerospace, but they had a very similar experience. And it's hard to dismiss when you start hearing these similarities. I'm a prosaic first kind of explanation person as well, but they have some things in common, right? They both are going into the same high altitude airspace. They're both having similar experiences. So what is it? It's fascinating to think about.
So with that in mind, let's tell the narrative, the chronology of what happens to eventually getting to the X Prize flight that is flown by Brian Binnie. I think there's a flight that Mike Melville does in May of 2004. And there's a chilling moment in the film. You're actually looking over the shoulder of Mike Melville as he's hurtling in his spacecraft up into orbit. And it's clear he's going to get there, but unfortunately the craft is spinning madly and the instrument panel goes black. And instead of aborting, Mike keeps on going. It's quite a breathtaking decision. And it's interesting. I notice in the film, they talk about the difference between somebody who's an intuitive pilot like Mike and Brian, who's the very proper, stiff Navy-trained pilot who does everything by the book. Do you think that was the key moment that saved the whole SpaceShipOne operation?
Wow, that's a really good question, Ross. There's something to that. I mean, because the flight before that, again, it's test flights, so you're constantly pushing the envelope. These flights were expensive. I don't think the whole program was in danger. Paul Allen's financing the whole thing, but you have enough failures in a row, maybe. But it's interesting because, Mike's flight, he lost the avionic power display. And the flight before that, they didn't get to the altitude that they want to test the data points that they wanted to test. So it was essentially like, there was other things that were tested, which was great. But some people looked at that flight as a failure. So Mike's flight, when he loses the avionics control during a supersonic boost, loses his display. It just goes black. Instead of aborting, which is what he's supposed to do, he just looks out the windows and keeps the black up around the nose of the cone going supersonic.
I mean, that's the incredible thing about it is that, I mean, you'd think it'd be pretty easy to navigate a space rocket because you're just going up. But really, when you're traveling that fast and craft is wobbling as much as it is, the only way to know where you're going is to look for the black and point the rocket towards it.
Going stick and rudder.
Quite an extraordinary moment.
Looking left, looking right, and going stick and rudder in the middle. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that was to me the moment in the film where I realized what a raw act of courage it was for these people to stick themselves in that rocket-powered vehicle and just hope like hell they'd be able to hold using their pilot skills to get themselves into orbit.
They're a different breed. I mean, test pilots, just being around them, I consider myself a proactive or measured risk taker. I don't mind risk. Life is full of risk, and I think you're not living a very good life if you don't risk. You're going to die with regrets, but these guys are at a different level. They're all about risk, and you can see it all over the film. And to your point, they couldn't be more different. Mike didn't graduate high school, eloped with Sally Melville, who's also in the film. They were married for 62 years. They got married as teenagers in Scotland. Again, never graduated high school, and just built Burt Rutan used to have this company where he'd do home-built kits. And Mike bought one of those home-built kits and built the Very Vegan, and then flew out to have Burt Rutan certify it. And Burt was so impressed by him that he became the first employee of that company, and Sally became the second. So they go way back. They're best friends. Burt was like his best man. So even that relationship is just so beautiful and amazing. But yes, Brian and Mike couldn't be more different.
And so in June of 2004, June the 21st, 2004, there's the first space attempt. There's 20 to 30,000 people watching. The money man, Paul Allen from Microsoft, is there as well. It's a huge day. And Mike's been picked, much to Brian Binnie's upset, as the pilot again. And I think he thinks again that it's because of the hard landing. They're going with Mike because Mike's the intuitive flyer. And Burt Rutan in the movie admits, quote, "At times you're concerned you're going to kill your best friend." It must have been a hell of a responsibility for Burt, knowing that he was putting these guys onto a rocket-powered bowl, really, and there was not a huge amount he could do if they lost control of it.
Absolutely. I mean, again, they were just, they were best friends. They'd known each other for, gosh, I don't even know the amount of decades. So it must have been like 3 decades. He was best man at Mike's wedding, or not wedding. Mike was best man at his wedding. He cared about this person that he was putting into this spacecraft that could potentially die. And so Burt's a tough human being. I mean, I spent time with him. I was in his house in Coeur d'Alene, super gracious. But he's tough. He lets you know, like, the way it is. And it was the only time I ever saw him cry or get emotional, was when he was talking about Mike. And when that plane landed, because Mike wasn't supposed to fly again, even though he did, when Pete dropped out, he was reliving. You could tell he was right back there again. Like, I've just not only gone to created the first private astronaut, but my best friend is that private astronaut, and he's lived. And he felt so relieved that had happened.
Now, that in and of itself doesn't win the X Prize. That's not enough to win the X Prize. To win the X Prize, you've got to do the 2 flights within 2 weeks with 600 pounds on board and, land successfully. So there's a decision that has to be made for Burt Rutan. Is he going to proceed with trying to win the X Prize? And of course, there's a huge decision in that involves whether it's worth the risk to the lives of the men he's going to ask to go on that flight. What does he decide to do, Kevin?
Well, I'm sure Burt wishes it was just his decision, but he was under the power of the financial, decision-making of Paul Allen, right? So in Mojave Aerospace Ventures. So the initial intention from the very beginning was to prove that you could build a private space program for very inexpensive compared to traditional aerospace and take it to space. They did that in June of 2003. Mike Melville flew to space. To win the X Prize, you had to have the equivalent of 600 pounds There were some things that went wrong on that space flight that weren't public, that are in the film, where it cautioned everybody on going further. And not only that, but they were going to have to add 400 pounds of ballast. And they had only just made it to space on the last flight by a little over 400 feet. So there were some engineering problems they were going to have to figure out in a very short period of time. Because again, this is June of 2004. They have the end of the year, 2004, to fly to space twice more, add 400 pounds, and they've only just made it to space by 400 feet. How are they going to do that? So Paul Allen, and also the Smithsonian had called them to say, we'll accept the spacecraft and put it into the Milestones of Flight gallery if you give it to us. And Burt thought the program was over at that point. And you can hear it in some of his language now that I've seen other film, like right after that. You can hear it like he's almost subtly saying to his employees, this might be a possibility. But ultimately, Paul Allen decided to move forward with the final two X Prize flights, and through remarkable engineers and creativity, they vetted a whole bunch of ideas, some super sketchy and dangerous, but ultimately one that worked.
So the first flight is Mike Melville. How does that go?
That's the one where Mike Melville, so what happened, everything's a reaction to something that happens before it. So on the one where he went to space, he kind of kited the spacecraft, again, going supersonic, and they flew 20 miles outside of their box, their designated FAA box. So they had to get like even FAA permission to fly the last two flights, and they didn't even think that was going to happen. So what they really worked on was turning vertical, and so as soon as you're dropped from the mothership and the rocket fires, you just want to make that turn as fast as possible. That's what they decided to do. And Mike went into the vertical, which the airstream is pointing essentially straight down, and they didn't appreciate some of those aerodynamics. So like for the X-15, you had a big wedge which could control that airflow. For SpaceShipOne, you had nothing. So anything can kind of upset that equilibrium when the angle of attack is straight down. And so in this case, it was probably the rocket motor, spinning left and right a little bit, and the thing just starts spinning. And they lose control of it so fast, and it spins 29 times in the vertical. But again, Mike, being the cowboy that he was, continues on up, just spinning, I think at like 240 degrees a second or something. It's in the film and you can see it, and it's nauseating and unbelievable. And if he wasn't at that center of gravity, he would have just passed out. But it's very hard to watch. And when he gets back down on the ground and he reunites with Sally, it's so emotional. Again, they were married forever, 62 years at the time when I did the film. Mike's just not going to fly after that. He's just looked death in the face again, and lived.
And so the final X Prize, the X Prize attempt, is in October 2004. And against all odds, Brian Binnie, who thought that he'd be defined for life by the hard landing that had semi-damaged SpaceShipOne, finds himself the pilot who's going to achieve this milestone in world history, winning this X Prize, the Ansari X Prize. Talk us through what happens in that flight.
Well, just on just going up underneath the mothership, Brian's just thinking about all the strange things that led him to this moment. And when he's ready. I mean, he's so ready to redeem himself. He's 10 months before that was the crash. He's gotten this another unusual circumstance, and he's just determined not to ruin it. So he thinks about, again, the bubbles of light going on the way up, and their appearance. He has faith that they've maybe know something that he doesn't. Regardless, they've given him hope to get to this day. But he's an incredible pilot. But even he said that and this isn't in the film, but he told me privately, I got it on camera, but he said, I wasn't that good for this to be the perfect flight. They didn't roll at all. It had no anomalies. Every other test flight in the whole program, as you'll see, had something go wrong that they had to deal with in the moment for either people to survive or to safely get back down on the ground. And that was the one quote unquote perfect flight. And Brian just felt so, I don't know, just honored to get it, like that it was much bigger than him. And thank God it ended that way, because it was such a different life than one that would have been led by potentially being defined by a failure.
And the fascinating thing is, at that very moment, he actually attributes the reason why he got to where he got to those weird bubbles of light that showed themselves to him in his backyard that night 10 months earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he had enough chance to think about it and process it, but it's another just one of these beautiful moments in the film. I mean, as you saw, Brian, he was a quiet individual, but he could speak like a poet. I mean, when he spoke, there are things he says that just vibrate through your core, whether it's the bubbles of light or his experience being alone in space. He was the last person to fly to space alone. The way he talks about space in that moment it still sends chills through me. And I've seen the film hundreds of times. He's an amazing human being.
Do you think something key question that comes out of all of this, Kevin, and we're getting close to a wrap here, but do you think he was given a nudge, a helping nudge by something else?
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm a prosaic person first. Brian was too. But just all the data points, I don't know. I think something's watching out there in the desert, you know. I mean, there's a lot of interesting things out there with Edwards and Plant 42 and I've seen some pretty amazing things. But yeah, I think something revealed itself to Brian very intentionally, you know.
It says so much about the resources and the can-do of the American space program that this was a record, the record that was broken by Brian Binnie and Burt Rutan and the team. It had previously been made by the X-15 in 1963. Why do you think there hadn't been a commercial space venture before that to break that record?
Well,
and it fascinates me. I'm interested also in developing as a finale here. Do you believe that the technology that we see that the United States has represents the totality of the technology that they actually have?
Wow.
Because really, ultimately, the X-15 was a 1963 invention, and it took. What was it to get from 63 to 2004? I mean, that's 40 years. It took 40 years to get to that point where a manned commercial operation could do the equivalent. Do you suspect there's something else in the black that the US is holding back on?
Well, I think they're two different questions. To address the first question, I think the reason why it took so long for private aerospace is simple. It's money. It's really expensive to do these programs. I mean, I don't have a number on the X-15 program, but that's what Burt modeled his SpaceShipOne program after. But I know Burt's number when he secured financing from Paul Allen was $19 million from scratch. Mothership, simulator, spaceship from scratch. That's nothing. So he wanted to. Burt's goal was, and Paul's goal was, to build a private spacecraft program to show the world that it was possible for a fraction of the cost to do these things. And you see that echoing through today. All those people were watching this program. All those people were approached for the X Prize money, you know? So Elon Musk was approached. He was watching the program. Jeff Bezos was approached. He was watching the program. They all, you know, they had seeded Blue Origin and SpaceX before that, but there was no, substantial development. There was nothing that was going to suborbital. So they all, it was just money that was the separator. And I think that's now NASA looks at it like you see the Bush doctrine, from I think 2004. It's a big shift to private aerospace to save the American taxpayer money and focus on, lunar and solar destinations, for public aerospace. Do I think there's things in the black that we don't know about? Absolutely. I mean, no question. I could talk about some of them if you want specifically, but yeah, I mean, you look at, the history of stealth alone, when was that publicly unveiled in the Gulf War, right? In a big way. But, decades before that, there's all kinds of development that you see. So what do we have now that hasn't been seen publicly? I've heard some stories. I know people have seen some things. But yeah, there's absolutely things out there.
Finishing up, Kevin, has the Brian Binnie story and I think your own family experiences changed your worldview? Are you more open to the possibility of anomalous phenomena being real as a result of what you've learned along the road?
Yeah, absolutely. No question. I'm a big reader, and I know a lot about astronomy, and I know how big, the universe is, in some way, as much as you can. But trillions of planets and moons out there, you think we're alone? No, absolutely not. There's probably bacterial life, all kinds of Nobel laureates and astrobiologists think that there's life in our own solar system. Maybe it's not complex life, but it's everywhere. So as long as we're not an anomaly, which I think is hubris to think that we are, what else is out there? What's more advanced than we are? And again, the Space Kepler telescope detected biosignatures 120 light years away. I think they've known about us for a long time.
And on that note, Kevin Curran, thank you so much for joining Reality Check and congratulations on a wonderful film. Where can people see it and when will they be able to see it?
They'll be able to watch it on Apple on May 5th, which is the anniversary of 1961 when Alan Shepard reached space.
And it's Beyond Blue Sky, the film name, and based on the book written by Brian Binnie called
The Magic and Menace of SpaceShipOne.
Well, something tells me that that day that Brian had that weird anomalous experience, something was looking out for him. And it makes me very optimistic and positive about the future of humanity's engagement with space. Thank you so much, Kevin Curran.
Thank you, Ross.